The next item is the motion on evictions. There is also an amendment to this motion, copies of which have been circulated. Councillors Belton and Daly, would you now move and second your motion? Councillor Daly.
Second the motion.
Thank you. Councillors Ellis and Govinda, would you now move and second your amendment?
Madam Mayor, I would like to move the amendment.
I have agreed that Councillors Belton and Govinda can speak up to 10 minutes on this item. Councillor Belton.
Madam Mayor, can I first start in moving this motion to enunciate the 5 basic principles which I hope we can all agree with. First of all, that our policies should not cause damage to the innocents, whoever they may be. Secondly, that they shouldn't be carried out in an arbitrary way. Third, that in the crisis, if you like, of August, we need a penal and social policy that is effective. Fourth, that local authority leadership is important in all this. And fifth, that eviction is perfectly valid in cases of housing management, and I stress in cases of housing management. However, clearly I want to argue that eviction should not be used essentially for penal policy across the country outside of the remit of housing management in a direct sense. And I'd like to get straight onto that, but first of all I have to tackle a notion put around by Councillor Govinda in an article in the Times, and indeed by many Conservatives, that quotes, "The long-term security of a council flat or house is a privileged position." Can I say I can find no dictionary definition about privilege that comes anywhere near to meeting that criteria. It's certainly not the kind of privilege that members of the Bullingdon Club aspire to. It's certainly not the kind of privilege that many of us aspire to. It's not what we mean when we talk about privileged classes. But in a way, we retire from that, the Conservative Party, by saying subsidise housing. Well, actually, no. This year, Wandsworth tenants, to be more accurately, contributed 22.6 million to the National Housing Revenue Account Exchequer, and that, for the third year in succession, contributed to the National Exchequer and us, the taxpayer. This is an interesting kind of privilege. The truth is, the majority party have a grace and favour view of council tenants and council stock, that it is a grace and favour gift in their hand, a little bit like a feudal barony. It is not. It occurs, our powers are there as a result of Act of Parliament. Much of it is a statutory obligation. It is not something we can withdraw because we feel like it. But those are the outline principles. I want to go back to the details of eviction itself. First of the principles I mentioned was that the innocents shouldn't suffer. And of course, I can be as emotional as anyone else about the innocents who run the shops on Battersea Rise and about all the people who are terrified, including many of my constituents. With due respect to people being emotional about that, that is the easy bit. What is more difficult, and what takes a bit more courage, is to stand up for the innocents fairly closely associated to the guilty or the alleged guilty. That is a completely different and more arduous task, to stand up for their rights. And that's what I think we should be doing, standing up for their rights. Councillor Govinda's article, I don't know whether it was his heading, but the article is headed, "Evicting rioters is being fair to their neighbours." Well, I can assure you that in the notorious case we're talking about, that's not the view of the neighbours at all. The neighbours are at the moment collecting a petition asking the council not to proceed with this. And why would they? Because she works for a charitable organisation on the estate. She runs a support group looking after or trying to assist largely single mums. She's well known on the estate. She brings kids back from school for her neighbours. She looks after them whilst they're at work. The last thing that those neighbours want is for this particular person to be evicted. So can I just suggest that concern for the innocents, even if associated in this case to the alleged villains, but to the villains, is of some consequence. My second principle was that it should not be arbitrary. And of course it has to be arbitrary. There is no way it cannot be. I've checked out with the housing director. Is there a system for the courts to notify the council of people who are charged or convicted? No, there is not. And that's no great surprise, is it? There might be special steps right now because of the events of last August, but no, there is not a system. And you can see why the police and the courts wouldn't particularly want there to be a system. It's interesting also that, talking about the arbitrary nature of it, I mean, if you think of that in logical terms, there's 80,000 prisoners in this country, give or take a few. If the proportions are anything like they are in Wandsworth, then 20,000 of those will be council tenants. If you take whatever percentage of that may apply, there must be 200 council tenant families in this borough with their menfolk usually inside right at this moment. Are you going to apply that to all them? Are you going to put them all on the streets? Surely not. Indeed, it's interesting, a reference to an education committee paper tomorrow night, which has already been mentioned. The 14 10 to 17-year-olds who have been charged. 5 of them, I happen to know because I've asked, 5 of them live on council estates. These 5 are beyond the age of criminal responsibility, but as minors, one might think that their parents have more responsibility for them than the woman who's being faced by eviction. So in principle, although the measured paper, which Councillor Gibbons is quite right saying, is measured, and clearly does not say they should be evicted, but in principle, if you're not going to be arbitrary unfair, then all 5 of those should get the eviction notices tomorrow. Indeed, I'm fascinated to know why they have not. So the second principle about the arbitrary nature of it. Interesting enough, by the way, one of them is a looked-after child. And it must have occurred to Councillor Tracy and Councillor Dawson, who I see is missing at this point, but as Cabinet Member and Chair of the OSC, in principle, they will know that all 60 of us should be evicted as being in loco parentis. And I suggest that Councillor Tracy and Councillor Dawson should be the first of them as being more in loco parentis than the rest of us. But in the longer term, we cannot, of course, rely on the simplistic, platitudinous analysis of criminality, pure and simple. Just possibly the Prime Minister is allowed to get away with that on the morning after the major riots. I think that's probably acceptable in a press conference outside number 10. And it is clear, as Councillor Osborne said very clearly, that there was some criminal activity, possibly a majority of criminal activity. But it's also true that there's a match between those charged and their addresses, that is, and the most deprived wards in the country. There is a match. Not an exact match, but there is. And I think Councillor Boswell may talk further about the implications or the genesis of what happened. I could, of course, say a great deal about the judicial side of it, like guilt before trial, like double jeopardy, like the impacts on tenants rather than, say, leaseholders. 2 guys, just imagine, 2 lads, next-door neighbours, go smashing the street apart. Absolutely. But one of them is a tenant, and the other one's parents struck lucky and a leaseholder. One gets 6 months inside. They both get 6 months inside. One of them gets evicted, and the other one's family doesn't. Is this fair? Of course it is not. But I think Councillor Daly will talk a little bit more about that too. I could also talk about the impact on the majority, because the majority, if this eviction process were to go ahead, would be affected, would be women and children. Now, I don't want to label this as a sexist policy, because everyone dismisses that immediately. But the fact is, the majority will be women and children. And is that what we do to maintain a socially cohesive society where families are, well, the Tory party has something to say about policies about families, doesn't it? Finally, there will be a descent into the contract argument. They signed a contract. How many of you have ticked boxes this week buying a piece of software or whatever it is without reading every single word of the contract? Now, that's minor, it doesn't really matter. How many of you signed the contract before your boy was even born 10, 15 years ago, when you had no idea that this might be happening? How many of you would retreat into that and then get the ultimate cop-out of all, say it's the county judge's decision? The ultimate cop-out of all, local authorities who conduct their policies on that basis do not deserve to have more power devolved to them. Make the decisions for yourself and be proud to stand up for them.